There's a woman named Sarah sitting at her kitchen table at 3 a.m. In front of her, a calculator. Beside it, a stack of bills. Upstairs, two kids are asleep, with no idea that next month their mother doesn't know how she's going to make rent. She opens the Bible app on her phone. Types one word: anxiety. The first verse that comes up is from Jesus himself. 4 words: do not worry. And Sarah closes the app. Because for her, and for the millions of people who are genuinely anxious tonight, those words don't bring comfort. They make it worse. As if Jesus had never had to pay rent. As if he were standing somewhere with no bills, no diagnoses, no crying child, and an empty bank account, and gently calling down from there, don't worry. But here's what no one ever told Sarah. Jesus isn't saying what everyone thinks he's saying. This passage, Matthew 6, is not a soft consolation. It's not a pretty verse for the weak. This passage is a philosophical challenge. It's saying that your worry isn't wrong because it makes you suffer. It's wrong because it's running on a broken view of the world. And once you understand what Jesus actually means, your anxiety will never sound the same again. I've read Matthew 6 hundreds of times, and for most of those readings, I read it wrong. Until one day I stopped and asked a question I should have asked a long time ago. Who was Jesus talking to when he said this? The crowd on that hillside in Galilee wasn't middle class. They were day laborers, fishermen with no property, people who genuinely didn't know what tomorrow's dinner would be. When Jesus said, "Do not worry about what you will eat," he wasn't talking to people with full refrigerators. He was talking to people for whom tomorrow's meal was an open question. That changes everything. Because if Jesus was saying this to people who actually had reason to worry, and he still said don't, then he was operating on something we're missing. Some logic hidden beneath what sounds like a simple sentence. And that logic lives inside a single Greek word, a word that the English translation has flattened so completely that almost no one realizes what it actually means. In the English translation, Jesus says, "Do not worry." 2 words. It sounds like an emotional command: stop feeling worried. And that's exactly how most people understand it. An inner directive, a button you're supposed to press to switch the worry off. But the original Greek word Jesus actually used, merimnao, is not a word for an emotion, it's a word for a state. And this is where everything begins to shift. The root of merimnao comes from an older word, meris, which means part, division, fragment. A piece, a part torn away from the whole. Merimnao literally means to be pulled in many directions at once. To be divided, to be torn into pieces. Jesus isn't saying don't feel worried. Jesus is saying don't let yourself be torn apart. Sit with that for a moment. Because if you've ever actually been inside a wave of anxiety, you know this is true. You don't feel sad. You don't feel scared. You feel divided. One part of you is here, sitting in this room, trying to work, trying to sleep, trying to hold a conversation with the person across from you. Another part is in the worst-case scenario, living inside the outcome you fear most, experiencing it as if it had already happened. Another part is running numbers, calculating, measuring, assessing risk. Another part is rewinding the past, analyzing what you said last week, what you should have done differently. 4 parts, 1 person, all running in parallel. You're not worried, you're split into 4, and that is exactly the word Jesus chose. When you read the verse through this lens, its entire meaning shifts. Jesus isn't issuing an order to your emotions. He's diagnosing a structural problem. He's saying, you're living as if you were several people at once, and a human being can't live that way for long. This is why advice like just calm down or stop thinking about it never works. Because that advice assumes you're a unified person feeling a single emotion. But you're not unified. You're breaking into pieces, and each piece is trying to live a life of its own. You don't need to control your emotions. You need to be put back together as one person. And this is where Jesus is about to do something very different from what anyone expects him to do. He doesn't give you a breathing technique. He doesn't tell you to count your blessings. He doesn't suggest you sit still and settle yourself. He points to 2 small things outside, a bird and a flower, and he says, look closely, because these 2 things which you've walked past thousands of times in your life without ever really stopping, hold the answer to how you get put back together. Most people read Matthew 6, see the birds and the flowers, and assume Jesus is saying something like, "Look at how beautiful and peaceful nature is. You should be peaceful like that too." That's a Hallmark card reading, and it misses the point entirely. Jesus didn't pick the birds of the air because birds are beautiful. He didn't pick the lilies of the field because lilies are poetic. He picked these two things because they prove something very specific about how the universe works. Something that, once you see it, you can't see your own life the same way again. Look closely at what he actually says. The birds of the air do not sow, they do not reap, they do not store away in barns. This isn't a sentence about beauty. This is a sentence about economics. Jesus is pointing out that birds, the entire kingdom of birds on this planet, have no storage system. No silos, no granaries, no savings accounts, no backup plan for winter, and they still eat their fill every day. For millions of years. Now look at the lilies. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Again, not about beauty, about the absence of effort. Lilies don't labor, don't plan, don't try to become beautiful. And then Jesus adds a line that, if you read it carefully, is almost provocative. Even Solomon, in all his glory, was not arrayed like one of these. Solomon, the wealthiest king in the history of Israel. The man with 3,000 concubines, gold piled like gravel, wisdom that drew the whole world to learn from him. And Jesus says, a wild flower that does nothing at all is better dressed than he was. This is the moment of reversal. Jesus isn't saying take comfort because nature is beautiful. Jesus is saying look at how many things in this universe are fed, clothed, kept alive, without any plan at all. His logic is going somewhere. If God sustains billions of creatures incapable of worrying about themselves, then is worry actually the mechanism keeping you alive? Or is it an illusion you've carried your whole life without ever stopping to check? And here's where the story gets deeper. Because this isn't the first time God taught this lesson. 1,300 years before Jesus stood on that hillside, God did the same thing with the Israelites in the wilderness. They had just escaped Egypt. No fields, no grain stores, no way to provide for themselves in the middle of a dead land. And every morning, God dropped down manna, just enough for one day. This is the part most people skip over. There was a specific rule about manna that God put in place, and that rule reveals the entire point. No one was allowed to store any for tomorrow. Anyone who tried to secretly save some opened it the next morning, and the manna had rotted, worms, stench, inedible. God wasn't teaching his people food management. He was teaching them something far deeper. He was teaching them how to live without knowing all of tomorrow. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying again to the crowd on the mountain. Different language, different images, same core. Anxiety, at its deepest level, isn't an emotional problem. It's a problem of trust in time. You're trying to live tomorrow with today's resources. You're trying to stockpile certainty, and certainty cannot be stockpiled. It rots, just like manna. Jesus is pointing at the birds, at the flowers, at the whole of nature, and he's saying, there's an entire universe living without a storage system, and it's still alive. Maybe the problem isn't that you need a better plan. Maybe the problem is that you need a different way of living. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, I get what Jesus is saying. But that verse was for poor people on a hillside in Galilee 2,000 years ago. I'm not going hungry. I'm not living one meal at a time. My worries are completely different. This is where I want to tell you about David. David wasn't poor. He started a tech company at 28. His first paycheck wasn't huge, but it was enough. He leased a small office, and that night he lay in bed, unable to sleep. He was worrying about the office rent. 5 years later, the company was doing $10 million in revenue. He wasn't worried about office rent anymore. Now he was worried about cash flow. He was worried about making payroll for 40 employees on time. 10 years later, the company hit $100 million. Cash flow wasn't the issue anymore. Now he was worried about a competitor about to launch a new product. Worried about losing key talent. Worried about exit strategy. worried about whether the market would crash before he could sell the company. One night, David sat down and did something he had never done before. He wrote out a list of every single thing he had worried about over the past 15 years. And he noticed something that chilled him. Not one item on that list mattered anymore. The office rent, long since paid off. Cash flow, stable. The competitors he once feared, most of them had gone bankrupt or been acquired. Every worry that had once kept him awake at night now looked small, almost funny. But one thing wasn't small: the hours of sleep he had lost, the dinners where he hadn't really been present with his wife, his kids' birthdays where he had sat there, but his mind had been somewhere else. 15 years of anxiety had eaten something from him he could never get back, and given him nothing in return. This was David's discovery, and it's what modern psychology has confirmed. Anxiety doesn't shrink as your resources grow, it grows with them. The more you have, the more you worry, because now you have more to lose. Studies show that the CEO of a billion-dollar company doesn't worry less than an hourly worker. He just worries about more expensive things. This is exactly what Jesus was pointing out, 2,000 years before any psychological research existed. Jesus didn't tell the poor, "Don't worry, one day life will get better and the anxiety will disappear." He didn't promise that resources would cure worry. He was saying the opposite. Your problem isn't that you don't have enough. Your problem is the way you're living. And that is the best news an anxious person can hear. Because if anxiety could be cured by enough money, enough safety, enough control, no one in history would ever have been cured. And no one ever will be. Because enough is not a destination, it's a horizon that moves further away every time you walk toward it. Jesus is proposing something entirely different. Not more, not enough, but a different relationship with the very idea of enough. And to understand what that relationship is, we have to come back to him and look at a question he asks in the middle of this passage. A question that sounds simple, but if you actually sit with it, it will collapse most of what you thought you knew about anxiety. In the middle of this passage, Jesus asks a question. Just one. 16 words in the original Greek, and most readers of the Bible have walked past it dozens of times without ever stopping to actually answer it. Jesus asks, "Which of you, by worrying, can add a single moment to your life?" The question sounds rhetorical, as if Jesus is just driving home a point. But if you read it carefully, you'll notice he's doing something very different. He's forcing you to answer. And the answer, once you're honest with yourself, will make you uncomfortable. Think back to any time in your life when you genuinely worried about something. The job interview, the medical test, the hard conversation you had to have with someone, your kid leaving home for the first time. You worried, sometimes for a week, sometimes for a month, sometimes through many sleepless nights, and then it happened, one way or another. The interview unfolded the way it was always going to unfold. The test result was the result it was. Your kid grew up to become whoever he or she was always going to become. Jesus' question is, what did your worrying through every one of those sleepless nights actually change? Not one thing. This is what modern psychology calls futile rumination, the looping kind of thought that never leads to action. Planning is different. Planning has a starting point, an ending point, and a step of action in between. Worrying just runs in circles. Same fear, same scenarios, same what if. Questions, playing over and over in your head like a song you can't switch off. And Jesus, 2,000 years before brain science, pointed to exactly this with a single simple question. Can you add a single moment? No, you can't. Sit with that for a moment. Because this is what the anxious mind is very good at hiding. Worry feels like you're doing something, as if you're processing the situation, as if you're preparing yourself, as if you're holding control by constantly thinking about it. But it's an illusion. Worry isn't a tool. It's a tax you pay in advance on things that may never happen. And if you've been paying that tax your whole life, as most of us have, you need to hear this. You don't owe anyone that tax. There's no agency collecting it. There's no benefit coming back. You've just been paying into nothing, for years, and calling it being careful. This is where Jesus' question becomes impossible to answer. Because if worrying doesn't do anything, doesn't extend life, doesn't solve the problem, doesn't change the outcome, then what is it? Jesus' answer comes right after. And this is where the whole passage turns in a direction that few people follow him far enough to see. Because he doesn't just dismantle the illusion, he shows you exactly what to do instead. And that is the most quoted and the most misunderstood verse in all of Matthew 6. That verse is Matthew 6:33. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. This is probably the most quoted line in the entire Sermon on the Mount. It's printed on cards, posted on social media, referenced in countless sermons. And through years of repetition, it's been worn down so thin that it now sounds like a cliché. Just be more spiritual, and God will handle the rest. That is not what Jesus is saying. Look at the original Greek word. The word seek in the original is zeteo. This isn't a soft verb for looking. It's not searching with the eyes. It's a verb meaning to pursue relentlessly, to commit fully, to invest the whole of your strength in finding. When a hunter tracks the prints of his prey through a forest, that's zeteo. When a scientist devotes an entire career to solving a single problem, that's zeteo. When a mother searches for her lost child, that's zeteo. This isn't a passing interest. This is the central axis of a person's life. Jesus isn't saying, think about God when you have time. Jesus is saying, make the kingdom the central axis of your life, and let everything else arrange itself around that axis. And here's where modern psychology, unexpectedly, confirms what Jesus was teaching 2,000 years ago. There's a concept in psychology called the anchor. A boat isn't swept away by waves because the waves stop, the waves still come, the waves still pound. But the boat has an anchor driven deep into the seafloor. And that anchor holds it steady in the middle of the storm, not after it. Anxiety, at its deepest level, is not a problem of the waves. Anxiety is a problem of not having an anchor. This is what changes everything. Most of us are trying to cure anxiety by answering every question the mind throws at us. What if I lose my job? What if my child gets sick? What if my marriage falls apart? And we try to answer each one. We try to find a certain enough answer to silence the question. But the questions never end. Every answer gives birth to 3 new questions. That's why anxiety never stops on its own, because you're trying to fight an army with no limit. Jesus is saying something very different. He says, don't try to answer every question. Change the axis. And so you can see this isn't just theory. Look at Jesus himself. There's a moment in his life when this was tested at the most extreme level. After his baptism, Jesus was led by the Holy Spirit into the wilderness. 40 days without food, alone, exhausted, and at the moment he was weakest, Satan came with a series of questions. If you are the Son of God, why not turn these stones into bread? If you are truly under God's protection, why not throw yourself off the temple to prove it? If you want to change the world, why not take all the kingdoms of the earth? Each question was a trap. Each question could have pulled Jesus into a debate. That debate would have had no end, because every answer would have spawned another question. And what did Jesus do? He didn't argue each question. He didn't try to explain. He didn't try to come up with a clever enough answer to respond. He simply returned to one single anchor. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. One sentence, one axis. He didn't answer Satan's questions, he just held the axis. And Satan withdrew. This is exactly what Jesus is teaching you in Matthew 6. Anxiety isn't cured by answering every question your mind asks. Anxiety is cured by finding an anchor deep enough that the storm cannot move it. And that anchor, Jesus says, isn't in your bank account, isn't in your control, isn't in whether you know all of tomorrow. That anchor is in a completely different place. A place you only reach when you commit fully, zeteo, and not before. There's one final verse in this passage, and it's the one almost everyone reads past. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. This verse sounds almost pessimistic. Each day has enough trouble of its own. That's something a depressed person would say, not the Messiah preaching about peace. But if you've followed him this far, you'll see that this is the final piece. Jesus isn't promising you a life without difficulty. He isn't saying that if you make the kingdom your central axis, every day will become light. He's promising something very different. He's promising that you will have enough strength for today, not more. Not for tomorrow, just enough for today. And here's where an image from far back in the Bible returns, this time with a much deeper layer of meaning. Remember, the manna in the wilderness, just enough for one day. Anyone who tried to store some for tomorrow, that manna rotted. Why did God make such a strange rule? The answer is deeper than you might think, because faith cannot be stockpiled. You cannot trust God for the whole week at once. You cannot trust Him for the whole month. You cannot stockpile enough faith today to live off of it for an entire year. Faith only operates in one-day units, and every morning you have to step outside, look up, and ask for new manna. Now, back to anxiety. What is anxiety? Anxiety is when you try to eat tomorrow's manna with today's stomach. You're trying to digest the strength you'll need for a situation that hasn't happened yet. Trying to brace yourself for a storm that may never come. Trying to live a day you haven't been given. And today's stomach cannot digest that. It rots, just like the manna. This is what Jesus was pointing to in that final verse. Not pessimism, not surrender, but a truth about how human beings are designed. You weren't designed to carry tomorrow. You were designed to live today, with today's manna, with the strength given for today, and to let the God of tomorrow handle tomorrow when it comes. After many years sitting with this verse, there's one question I keep coming back to. And it's the question I want to leave you with, before we get to the final part of this video. If you only had to trust God for today, just today, could you do it? Most of us would say yes. Today I can trust. Tomorrow is another story. But that is exactly all Jesus is asking. Let's come back to Sarah, the woman at the kitchen table at 3 a.m., her 2 kids asleep upstairs, a stack of bills in front of her, a Bible verse on the screen she had closed because it couldn't comfort anything. Sarah didn't need Jesus to tell her, just relax. She didn't need anyone to promise her the storm would pass. She needed someone to show her a different way to stand in the middle of the storm, an anchor deep enough that the storm couldn't carry her away. A question clear enough, can I trust today? Instead of 1,000 questions about next month, next year, 10 years from now. A truth that she didn't have to carry tomorrow with today's strength, that she only needed today's manna, and the God of tomorrow would be there when tomorrow came. That is what Matthew 6 is offering her. Not a formula to erase worry, not a magic phrase, but a different way of living. This is what I want to leave you with. Anxiety tells you that your life depends on the things you are trying to control. Jesus says the opposite. Your life is held by what you cannot control. And that isn't frightening. That is the best news you will ever hear. Because if your life were held by you, you would have every reason to lose sleep. You aren't big enough to carry it. But if it's held by the one who feeds the birds, clothes the lilies, and dropped manna every morning for 40 years in the wilderness, then you can close your eyes now. Tonight, this night, the very night you're watching this video. Tell me in the comments, which part of Matthew 6 made you stop the longest? Was it the birds, the lilies? Jesus' question about adding a single moment to your life, the line about each day has enough trouble of its own. I'm genuinely curious, because for every person, a different detail is the one that lands. And if this video opens something up for you, share it with someone you know who's wrestling with anxiety tonight. Subscribe so you don't miss what we explore next. Thank you for staying to the end.